Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. Of course, you know we are. We are multi-award winning fan Tottenham Hotspur podcast. If you're with us for the very, very first time, you can find us on iTunes. We're on Spotify. We're across all major audio platforms. We're, of course, on X. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. And we are on Blue Sky too. Fair to say, the shows keep getting busier. The guests keep getting bigger. And the stories keep on getting busier and busier. And I will just say ahead of this show, I think this is going to be one of the most exciting shows that we've done across the summer, because getting to know Thomas Frank, this is where you're going to want to be. This is where you're going to want to know everything about the man and someone that's followed him ever so close. Before I bring in who that gentleman is, making his debut alongside me, I've got the wonderful Jim from Oh So Spurs. Oh, this man, he's been on a shift with me the last few weeks, and we're loving him. How are you, Jim?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, I'm enjoying the Last Word on Spurs marathon. It's been good fun.
We're covering all bases. We're covering all circuits. We're covering all journalists. A fresh face off the Spurs beat, I've got to say, on this show. Making his debut. Yes, in the end, we finally do get them all. I'm delighted to welcome to Last Word on Spurs, making his debut. Look, he's not been put through the ringer as much as us fans have been over the last however many years. He's still fairly freshly new to Spurs, although he'll probably tell you he's already seen enough already to know what Tottenham are about. We've got the wonderful Tottenham Hotspur correspondent from The Athletic. You'll know his dulcet tones from the view from the lane. We've got the brilliant Jay Harris making his debut. Jay, lovely to have you here. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all good, thanks. I think you guys have built me up too much now. I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to the hype. But yeah, thank you very much for the invite and for having me on.
Pleasure, mate. Listen, with Danny Kelly in competition, what can I say? The wonderful Danny Kelly. What a Superman he is, and what a great job you guys do on View from the Lane, which I know in general, look, being fans of obviously your podcast and what you do and fans of the football club, we all know that it has been a fairly challenging season, but it ended in an amazing moment of glory for Tottenham, in which we can't forget and which we won't forget on this show. Look, so much to discuss, so much to go into on this show. Look, this is going to be a real insightful, analytical view into Tottenham Hotspur's new head coach, Thomas Frank. Jay's going to tell us more about his journey as a journalist, in which he's covered Frank for a number of years. Then he got shifted to Tottenham. And guess what? Thomas Frank has come and joined him. So we're looking to hear Jay's thoughts on Thomas Frank and more, which will be, again, as I mentioned, a really important show for many out there to get to know more about the man behind the person. So mostly we'll do that on this show. Look, we've been starting in these last few shows with a latest wrap-up of all of the transfer news, views, in regards to the last 24, 48 hours. And that is where we will start on this edition of Last Word on Spurs, because as ever, the transfer world never sleeps. So let's take you through very quickly what appears to be the latest news on the rumour mill when it comes to all things Tottenham. And there are suggestions that Heung-Min will decide his future after an important meeting with new Tottenham Hotspur head coach Thomas Frank. We have had this confirmed out of the man's mouth. Diego Simeone was asked the question, does he want Christian Romero? He replied, obviously, he's a great player. The links to Bryan MBEUMO still do not go away. The latest we're hearing on Bryan MBEUMO, and we'll ask Jay about this as well, obviously knowing the player fairly well during his period at Brentford, is that Man United are relaxed about their pursuit of Bryan MBEUMO. Despite being aware of Tottenham's interest, it remains to be seen whether Tottenham will follow up with their initial talks or will move on to what's being described as an alternative target in Antoine Semenyo. And MBEUMO, though, is understood to be intrigued by Spurs, and with Thomas Frank having just been appointed, there are reports still that he's leaning towards Manchester United. In terms of other news that is coming out in the Spurs space, there are reports Tottenham are weighing up an approach for Everton defender Jared Braithwaite. Their interest, which could be formalised as soon as this week, comes despite the topics telling suitors that Braithwaite is not for sale this summer. I'm sure we'll come on to it as well during the show with relation to, of course, Thomas Frank's backroom staff, and Jay will know them very well from covering them from his period at Brentford as well. From what we're led to believe, despite a lot of speculation last week, first team assistant coach Klaus Norgard, who left Brentford, is understood that he will not be joining Thomas Frank at Tottenham. And obviously we'll keep you posted and more if that situation does change. And look, everybody loves a striker on Last Word on Spurs. And one that has been linked to Tottenham over the last 24 hours. And forgive me if I absolutely, completely kill off this name. Arnold Calamendo has been linked to the club, and Tottenham reportedly accelerated their interest in these last few hours. It's like that bingo card classic. Type them all off, tick them all off. Accelerated interest. 23 years old, professional debut at PSG, age 18. Silver medal at the 2024 Paris Olympic Games. 6 goals, 1 appearance in 252 minutes. So keep an eye on him. But overall for the club, 34 appearances, 18 goals, 4 assists. And just another slight bit of transfer news. Tottenham are not expected to enter the race to sign Jack Grealish. That is your transfer update. I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Jim from Oh So Spurs to kick off the man behind Tottenham's new head coach, Thomas Frank. Jim, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. Look, it's a pleasure to be on with you, Jay. And I would just genuinely say before we start, I have 2 subscriptions in my life. One's my phone bill, and one is my subscription to The Athletic. Genuinely, I don't normally buy into things, but it's generally cracking value for money. So
thank you.
I would recommend that to anyone who doesn't have it yet. But Jay, I'm sure most of the listeners are aware of who you are. But just for those who aren't, did you want to give us a brief summary of how you came to reporting on Spurs for The Athletic? Obviously, prior to Spurs, you were working for The Athletic, but reporting on Brentford. How did that journey go?
Yeah, do you want the full-blown origin story or just The Athletic years?
Right, so you start right from the hospital room.
Yeah.
No, just the 2-minute version.
Like most people, loved playing football when I was younger, and I quickly realised I probably wasn't good enough to go pro, but always loved reading and writing, always used to buy the newspapers and look up transfer rumours. So studied at a university, and I was quite fortunate. My university, Birmingham City Uni, had a scholarship scheme with Sky Sports. So every year you had to apply and interview. So obviously first year I forgot to do it. I was probably too drunk. Second year wasn't good enough. Third year managed to get it. And I think that sort of worked in my favor because it meant I graduated, did the 2-week scholarship scheme. And then they invited me back to become a freelancer in a really technical role behind the scenes. And I just sort of, once your foot's in the door of a company like Sky, it's sort of up to you to chase opportunities. I did that. And then for a couple of years, mainly during COVID, actually, I used to write the big yellow ticker on Sky Sports News, which was a lot of fun. Pressure, because believe me, if you make one spelling mistake, people notice it. And I wanted to make that next step. The Athletic sort of reached out. They had a talent ID day. I applied for it. I went to it over Zoom. And basically the boss rang me up and said, I want to interview you for a position. It's whoever wins the Championship player final this weekend between Swansea and Brentford. I'm a London boy. So I was like, please, Swansea don't win. I've got no interest in moving to Wales. Brentford won, and then just got thrown into that mad world of Brentford. And the first game I ever covered for them was when they beat Arsenal 2-0. And they were it felt like they were the centre of the universe that night because it was a Friday night. It was the first Premier League game with a full crowd after COVID. And it was like everybody was talking about it. This team who hadn't been in the top flight for 74 years. They beat Arsenal. I think Arsenal had loads of players out through COVID. So it was just a mad story. And then that's sort of what happened over the next 3 years, whether it was Christian Eriksen joining Brentford, Ivan Toney stuff, Brian Mbeumo, previous seasons, just playing amazingly well. There was always something fun going on at Brentford. And then I sort of wanted to cover a team that was in Europe. I wanted to go to Galatasaray away and Eintracht Frankfurt away. So the opportunity came up to cover Spurs. I jumped at it. And despite the losses, I've seen more losses this season than I ever saw at Brentford, believe it or not. I've enjoyed every single second of it. So, yeah.
Well, it kind of leads on to the next bit then. I'm keen to know from someone who's not, necessarily a Spurs fan. Obviously, you're a Brentford fan. But I kind of picture you sending a message to Tim and being like, can I just meet you for a coffee? And just leaning against the machine and be like, how did you put up with this lot as we're all having a meltdown as a fan base? But how did our reactions to everything, compare to the likes of Brentford, particularly with the way, I think with Ange, there was almost like a visceral feeling that he created amongst us fans that a lot of us couldn't put a finger on. And it was so deep that it rippled through to the players, to rumours are some board members that they'd linked to their exits. I'm obviously not asking you if that's true or not, but yeah, how do you think it compared?
I remember the opening day of the season against Leicester City, with the 1-1 draw, which I thought was, given the context, Leicester back in the Premier League, a very excited away day. The draw was not the worst thing in the world. And I just remember the fans and the comments on The Athletic being like, we're awful, like what's going to happen? And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because Brentford fans will tell you, if they were in the Championship, they'd be buzzing. So to be in the Premier League is like sensational for them. They just enjoy every single second. Even when they've had some heavy defeats, these fans are like, we're just lucky we get to go to St. James's Park and Old Trafford. So Spurs, it was very different, and I had to quickly sort of adjust to the different expectations. And don't get me wrong, the first few weeks, few months of the season, there were a few results where I felt really invested in what Postecoglou was trying to do. And I felt like the team had a really exciting trajectory and a really high ceiling. The game that really stands out is Old Trafford, because it was a few weeks into the season, just played them off the park, that Mickey van der Ven incredible assist. And I thought, wow, this team's going to win something this year. This team's special. And they did win something, but took the most unconventional route. So I completely understand, though, that with Postecoglou, I think one thing which really stood out for me is that he's actually quite a philosophical thinker. Sometimes in press conferences, in the embargoed section, where the cameras aren't normally on, the way he makes you think about the game is quite eye-opening. And one thing he said probably around April was how winning a trophy would change the club's perception of itself. It doesn't matter what fans of other clubs think about Spurs. It mattered what Spurs fans thought about themselves. And I think that was maybe one of the wisest things he ever said, because look at that outpouring of emotion which happened after Bilbao, and players saying that, you know, Van der Ven said before the Europa League final, everybody told me if I join Spurs, I'm going to be trophyless. And that tag's been completely eliminated. So it was a mad season. But I think I give Postecoglou a lot of credit for doing that and sort of recognizing that sort of monkey on the back of the fan base.
It's fair to say, Jay, that your interactions with Ange at times were quite funny. I know that I say for a lot of journalists that covered Ange in general, they sometimes wasn't too sure about how to maybe frame a question or ask a question. I think we've got to play out for those that are watching the show live, and then people will catch it back on the audio. Let's hear a discussion, and you'll give us actually tell us the discussion what it was about before I bring it in, so there's some context behind it. This discussion about you with Ange, about Vicario, I think it was Brentford, wasn't it? Tell us about this discussion.
Yeah, I think it was Brentford at home, when Vicario appeared to handle the ball outside the box.
Yep.
And there was a little bit of, no one was really quite sure whether it had been looked at by VAR or what the situation was. And of course, sometimes some journalists go in and they're trying to get a particular line out of a manager. I promise you I wasn't. I was just asking a question. It wasn't leading. And yeah, I'll let you guys make up for yourself whether I did a good or a bad job.
Let's hear it, and we'll hear back from Jay when we play this out to you guys.
Hi, Ange. Just wanted to know from your perspective what happened when Vicario appeared to, I think, touch the ball outside the box. What did you see?
I think I saw exactly what you saw.
Well, I'm not too sure what I saw. That's
Well, yeah, well, I'm not. What makes you think I'm sure?
Well, I'm not too sure. Maybe you were closer to the pitch than I was.
I was closer to the pitch. Okay. You were higher up, though. Yeah, so... Okay, so maybe I saw exactly what you saw. Thank you.
Ange Postecoglou. How would you describe him, Jay, as a character week to week? I mean, you were there, like I say, pretty much every week at the press conference. If it's the post-match, the pre-match, you're going to miss him. How do you feel that you won't be covering Ange at Tottenham?
Don't get me wrong. There were times where he was, you wouldn't quite know what mood he was going to be in. And you might ask what felt like a fairly simple question, and he might bristle at that. There was a question I asked him about Solanke not scoring in a while. And yeah, he definitely got a little bit irritated by it. There are times if people push too much on injuries, he didn't like it. And a lot of managers can be quite defensive at times. And obviously the pressure that Postecoglou was under, especially in the second 6 months of the season, you can sort of understand it. But like I just alluded to with his comment about the fan base, there were some times where he'd just say things that really made you take a step back. Like what he said about VAR and its impact on the game. He said something once about the stone cutter's credo, which was basically if you cut a stone or break a stone, it takes 100 strikes, and you only focus on the the 100th strike, the strike that cracks the rock, but actually there were 99 strikes before that were just as important. So I can't say there are too many managers that sort of make you sit back and think, wow, that's, a very interesting outlook on life. There were very funny stories about, it was in the build up to Tamworth, where I think a reporter said, how are your players going to deal with non-league facilities? And, they might have to get changed in the car park. And he sort of chuckled and said, well, back in Australia, I played a game where there were frogs on the pitch, poisonous frogs on the pitch or something like that. So I'm not too worried about Tamworth. I think I really liked him when he gave that insight into himself. But I also recognize, because I think of how other media and other journalists covered him, he didn't want to show that side of him too often. So it wasn't always fun and games. We definitely clashed a couple of times. But fair play to him. He said he'd win a trophy in his second season, and he did it. And so for that alone, he has my utmost respect. I think that's one of the coolest things you could ever do. Everybody sort of doubting you, and you went and did that. Fair play.
I do agree. Jay's going to come back in. Sorry, Jim will just come back in a second. But is that, just to ask you, Jay, is that the coldest quote of what it was now 2024, to say, I always win a trophy in my second season, and then 100%. To actually go and deliver it?
100%, because that was after the North London derby, if my memory is correct. And so, just lost at home, and people were sort of, not me, but I guess some people were ready to sharpen their knives already and sort of make a complete mockery out of him if that didn't happen. So all the drama with the injury crisis and maybe senior players underperforming, etc., managed to sort of navigate away through all of that and put it off. Definitely. I put it down as the quote of the season for Spurs, for sure.
Jay, we'll move to the future, though. I think that's what everyone wants to hear and to learn about. But just before, you've got one word answer to give us on this one. We can't give you any wiggle room. Were Spurs right to move on from Ange? And then we're going to move on to Frank.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to look to the future, to Thomas the Frank engine, aren't we, Ricky? So, look, but many Brentford fans have said he's the...
I got to say, just to be clear, we've now got Thomas the Frank engine on Last Word on Spurs for our watching audience. Don't tell us we don't make all things possible. Jim, carry on, please.
Some Brentford fans have said he was their favourite or even greatest manager in their eyes that have ever managed at Brentford. Would you go as far as that to agree with them? And what are some of the challenges that you think perhaps he faced? That we all know the media is quite heavy on the top six coverage, and often great work done by very good coaches is less noticed. And it feels like Frank did some things that perhaps also needed a bit more appreciation at times. The wage bill is often mentioned, but yeah, what do you think of kind of that reputation as the best Brentford manager ever, and some of the challenges he faced that perhaps go less noticed?
Yeah, so the only basically rival he has for being the best manager in Brentford's history is someone called Harry Curtis, who I believe managed Brentford in the 1930s, which was the last time they were in the top flight. So certainly the greatest manager in their modern history. There's probably not many, if anybody, who was alive when Harry Curtis was around. And in terms of his achievements, he took over when Brentford were mid-table in the Championship, and he's obviously guided them into what will now be a fifth season in the Premier League. But what I've tried to point out in lots of articles recently is he's had to deal with losing key players pretty much every summer. So I think he lost Neil Maupay quite early on. Then it would have been Ollie Watkins and Said Benrahma. And, after Brentford lost that 2020 Championship playoff final to Fulham, and funnily enough, I think Matt Wells was on Fulham's coaching staff that day. So that's the football industry works in mysterious ways. Brentford sold Watkins and Benrahma, and everybody said there's no chance they're going to get promoted. They've just lost two of their best players. They've signed Ivan Toney, but this guy's been playing in League One. We don't really know that much of what he's about. And they finished third again. They kicked on. Their first season in the Premier League, they lost Ericsson, and everybody said, they only avoided relegation because of Ericsson, which was not the case. If anything, David Raya coming back from injury had a bigger impact than Ericsson. That's not to say that Ericsson was not a wonderful player. I just want to make that clear. Then they lose Raya the following year. They lose Ivan Toney. So every time they had some sort of setback, Thomas Frank thought of a new way to change the team, whether that was tactically, whether that was through personnel. And he did it in such a unifying, positive way. All the fans completely love him. He's a very personal human. I'm sure people have seen videos of him going up to, as a young fan who supports Brentford, called Woody, who has Down syndrome, and Thomas Frank would always go up to Woody whenever he spotted him and, give him a hug or a handshake or whatever. So he was a great manager on the pitch, but also what he did away from the pitch, building that culture and that community with the players and the fans. I think that's why Brentford fans have such fond memories of him.
I have to ask you again, John, this point is a really intriguing point around the fact of when you look at his overall record at Brentford, because I think one of the key things that you look at, he's had one of the lowest wage bills in the division. They recorded 2 top half finishes in 4 seasons under him. You seem like the perfect person to ask this. What does make Thomas Frank a special person? Because I know he's in the hearts of many Brentford fans. And I think even when you look at the actual statements released from the club since his departure, the level of detail they go into thanking him, and by the fact he's always welcome back there. I mean, he's seen as an actual legend of the football club, isn't he, for what he's done there?
Yeah, he is. And I've said it wouldn't surprise me if they built a statue of him at some point in the future. When I've spoken to people, I remember speaking to Ben Ryan, who's Brentford's performance director, for a podcast they did a few years ago. And he said one of Thomas Frank's biggest strengths is that he's open-minded. He's willing to take suggestions from different people. Of course, when you're a head coach, it's vital that you're confident in your master plan, for want of a better word. But you should be able to take advice from other people. And I think a really good example of that is Keane Lewis-Potter, who was a left winger and had been capped for England under 21s at left wing. Because of an injury emergency, they put him at left back, and he was exceptional all of last season in a really unfamiliar role. And that's Thomas Frank adapting and trying something different. Secondly, he's incredibly warm and friendly to his players. I interviewed Pontus Jansson at the end of last year. And Pontus Jansson, when he was at Leeds, had a bit of a reputation for being a little bit egotistical. I don't know if you guys can remember the infamous Leeds-Aston Villa game where Leeds scored when a Villa player was injured, and Bielsa told Leeds to let a goal in. And Pontus Jansson's basically the only Leeds player that I think tries to make a tackle. He just refused to accept that. So there was this perception of him as having quite a big ego. And when I spoke to him, he said, Thomas Frank is a friend for life. He's an incredible coach. How he changed me as a person. He said, before I was someone who wanted to shine, wanted to be sort of like the center of attention, and he made me such a better leader. So I think the way he manages personalities is definitely another strong point. And I sort of alluded to it a minute ago, but his flexibility. He started off with Ollie Watkins, who was a left winger. He converts him into a striker. He's had Said Benrahma, Brian Mbeumo, Johan Wissa, Ivan Toney. These are all forwards who have unique traits, but he still managed to turn all of them into extremely good goal scorers. Everybody used to say, Brentford are Route 1, Raya hits it long to Ivan Toney, they're direct, they score from set pieces and throw-ins. It's not that interesting. Brentford finished 10th this season, or last season, playing some really exciting football with Wissa, Mbeumo, Schade, Damsgaard. They're very different to the team that got promoted and stayed in the top flight. So it's that constant evolution, which I think Spurs fans should take positively, to say this is not someone who just rests on his laurels. He's constantly thinking of, how can I take this team to the next level?
And a lot of the managers around him in the league, the ones who have managed the media well, are typically quite conceited characters that you can feel the ego, and the ego is a harsh word. You feel the pride they have of their own achievements, which means they're often, less scared to stand up for themselves in the media. But Frank seems he does have that air of confidence, but he doesn't give us an air of arrogance. How do you think he's going to handle the additional criticism? Because there will be people in the media, right, who are itching to, slap some kind of tag on him, be that, and some will be negative as well as positive.
Yeah, so one of his catchphrases that he really likes is confident but humble. It's something that he always tells his players, believe in yourself, but don't be arrogant. And Thomas Frank will talk about him, especially when he's been linked to other teams in the past, about how it is a nice boost to his ego. It tells him that he must be doing something right. But I think he has always remained grounded. He's had a pretty impressive journey. He started out in Denmark. He was with the Danish youth teams. He was head coach of Brøndby in Denmark, who are one of the biggest teams in Denmark. And then he comes to Brentford to be an assistant. I wouldn't say that was a hit to his ego, but things didn't work out at Brøndby. He left in quite controversial circumstances. I might be able to touch on that a little bit later. So for him to then come to Brentford, he sort of had to build himself up bit by bit. He lost 8 of his first 10 games at Brentford. I'm sure that was a hit to his ego. But I think he's just, always remained quite grounded. And in terms of how he handles the media, for me, this is something that's going to be super interesting because during my 3 years covering Brentford, a lot of the time, especially with away games, I'd be the only Brentford reporter there. So it'd basically be me for 3 or 4 minutes asking Thomas Frank, oh, that was a great result, or that was a bad result. And so he wasn't really getting interrogated in the same way that Postecoglou has been this season when there's been particularly bad results. And I think a lot of the time, Thomas Frank is quite controlled and measured after games. You don't really see his emotions in the same way that maybe you could see Postecoglou's frustration. So how will that translate to Spurs when you've got me and 9 others asking him, why did you not make a substitution? Or why did that goal go in? Or why has the team conceded 5 goals from set pieces in 5 games? I think that will be a slightly different challenge for him. But having said that, he has also said in the past that he found it harder, the pressure at Brøndby, because he's from Denmark. It's one of the biggest clubs in Denmark compared to Brentford. So maybe he's a little bit more prepared for that. But the Premier League is a different beast to the Danish Superliga.
We'll just had a question from one of the live audience members here. This is from Come On You Purs. Some of these tag names. Jay, in an interview, he did state that he can lose his temper if he has to. Jay, have you ever seen Thomas Frank ever lose his cool?
Of course I have. There's a really, really famous example. And I'll give a little bit of a backstory about it. When Brentford played Man United in January 2022, Brentford were better than Man United for most of the game, but they lost 3-1, I think. And after the game, Thomas Frank said, we battered Man United, we absolutely destroyed them. He was like, and I'm not paraphrasing, he did say those words. So quite punchy. My cousin's a big Man United fan, and I remember him messaging me saying, what on earth is this manager doing? Tell him to pipe down or something, which did make me chuckle. And then I think that was a Wednesday night. So Friday, we're in the press conference, and I think I sort of said to him, how do you reflect on what you said post-Man United? And he said, I lost control of my emotions. I need to set a better example to the players, so I'll do that going forward. Sure, fine. Let's draw a line under the sand. Except 24 hours later when they play Wolves, the end of the game, he goes up to Moutinho and Neves, confronts them. I think he might even push Moutinho. He gets yellow carded by the referee, Peter Banks, and then turns around and says, you've shown me one, you may as well show me the second yellow card. And he gets sent off. And please go back and watch the highlights on YouTube of this game, because when he gets the second yellow card, you can see on his face, he realizes how petty that comment was. So that's the best example. There's also footage, if you scroll on Twitter, I'm sure you can find it, but in 2020 playoff semi-final against Swansea, he has a bit of a confrontation with Connor Roberts because it's deep in injury time. I think Brentford only have a 1-goal advantage, and he picks up the ball when it's gone out for a throw-in, and then he drops it behind his back, and him and Connor Roberts sort of grab each other by the scruff of the neck. But in the last few years, I've not really seen him lose his cool that many times. He will always say, my body is burning after a defeat. But I think he definitely, compared to Ange, takes a little bit longer to do his media duties. You seem to have to wait for him a little bit more. Right. I always noticed that Postecoglou came in quite quickly. Yeah. And maybe I'm just seeing a pattern when there isn't one, but I almost think Thomas Frank might purposely do that to take an extra 5 minutes to chill out, so he's composed himself and he doesn't say anything too outrageous in the post-match press conferences.
Can you believe, Jay, how your kind of journey's gone through your career in which you've somehow ended up back with Frank? Is that a weird one? I mean, are you looking forward to that? I mean, I presume, because you touched upon it there as a journalist, that you'd have quite a bit of time sometimes with him in certain away games, for example. I would imagine, obviously, that access you had with him, it's going to be very different this time around at a club like Tottenham, right? And given the nature of the size and the amount of journeys that cover Spurs week in, week out, how do you envisage that to change? Because he's going to know you, he's going to see you, and it's great, I suppose, for you. You've already got that foundation of a relationship there, right, with him?
Yeah. Of course, it's nice. It is so bizarre to be reunited after a year. I really enjoyed covering him because, as I sort of said in the beginning of the show, I'd wanted to be a journalist for a really long time. So the fact that he was the first manager that I covered is always going to mean something special to me. I hope that doesn't come across too soppy for people, but I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Of course.
And he's a very friendly person. I think he's very open. I think he does give you quite interesting answers on tactical questions, maybe a little bit more than Postecoglou does. Postecoglou was always sort of kept his cards quite close to his chest. And obviously, if you ever said to Ange, "Oh, you seem to be being a bit more pragmatic in Europa League," he instantly dismissed that. Whereas I think Thomas Frank would sort of explain what his theory is a little bit more. And yeah, it will be a different dynamic because there were lots of games. I remember Brentford played an FA Cup game against Port Vale in my first season covering Brentford. And I think Thomas Frank was genuinely so surprised that I actually made that journey. I think we had maybe like a little fist bump on the pitch. He's like, wow, you've come to Port Vale away. So yeah, of course, that's my job. So the dynamic will be a little bit different because there'll be far more people. But I'm sure it will still be, I'm really looking forward to covering him because I always felt like he deserved the opportunity to work for a club with much bigger resources. So now he's got that. I'm really intrigued to see how he handles it.
Well, it's a beautiful segue, Jay. That's where we are going to go next and talk about the due diligence that Frank admittedly would be doing on any future club. I've done enough talking, so Jim will take that. Before we do, we said we've got some kind of fun clips to show throughout this show. For listeners on audio, we've got some nice interactions of Jay with Tottenham Hotspur's new head coach, Thomas Frank. Let's have a look at some of Jay in action with Thomas Frank as we played throughout this show.
We have lost our best offensive player this season. I think I can't even, Jay, you maybe know that more. How many goal contributions he's had this season? 9 in 15. I think, no, it's more. I think, no, it's more. Yeah, I think it's 11, 15, something like that. I think it's 7 goals and 4 assists. That says everything. I shouldn't have asked you. I put you on the spot.
You know what, Jay, I got to say, there's some really funny clips there. We've got these that we're going to cover out the show. There's a clearly, like I say, real trust in you there in terms of just even from stats. I mean, I know on that one there, it maybe didn't go the way it was meant to, but he clearly does have a real fondness for you, right? I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, the thing with that situation is that it wasn't me who asked him that question. So obviously I'm just listening to the response, sort of getting ready to ask my own question. And then it sort of caught me off guard anyways. Yeah. And I think there was some sort of confusion in my brain. I don't think I added on the assists or something. And I'm sort of just glad he said, sorry for putting you on the spot, because in that moment where I got it wrong and he corrected me, I was like, oh, this is horrendous. This is awful.
Well, on that point, let's look at one clip where he was very proud of you in terms of getting some statistics right. Let's bring that in.
Oh, yeah.
Last year, after 3 games, remember our goal difference? What it was after 3 games?
You conceded 1.
Yeah. How many did we score? Go on, Jay, come on. Put you on the spot here. 3. Yes, 3-1. Well done. 3. Yeah. Good. That's like in the theater that we're sitting down there and doing the secret signs. And this time it's 8-5, which is scoring 8 goals in the Premier League in 3 rounds. That's remarkable.
He was proud of you there, Jay, wasn't he? He was proud of you on that one.
Yeah, but the point he's trying to make at the end is the press officer was sort of giving me signals to say, I think it's 3 goals, because my brain just completely froze. I was like, they beat Arsenal 2-0, drew 1-1 with Aston Villa. And I was like, what was the 3rd game of that season? That's all I could think about. So, yeah, it was a 0-0 against Crystal Palace, which I obviously scrubbed from my mind for good reason.
I love that. Look, welcome back to Last Word on Spurs, the second half of the show. There's over 5,500 of you that are watching us live. Thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs as we keep you inundated throughout the summer. Wonderful journalists that are joining us throughout. Obviously, of course, the Tottenham beat. I told you we'd get them all eventually. We've got another one on our back. So we've joined by the wonderful Jim at Oh So Spurs and the brilliant Jay Harris from The Athletic, a man that does know Thomas Frank ever so well. In our opinion, you're going to need to listen and watch this show to get a real insight into Thomas Frank, the man, and what he's going to bring to Tottenham. And I think everything about Tottenham, and if you do your homework about working for Daniel Levy, there'll be a lot of talk around the word due diligence. And if you go and listen to a lot of the podcasts, a lot of the TV shows that have been out there, that word has come up a lot. On that point, it's easy for me to hand a hospital word over to Jim and talk about a bit of due diligence that Frank might have done. Jim, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, I'd just say on that last clip, it really reminded me of like when a teacher at school has a soft spot for the naughty kid in the class and lets them get away with everything. But yeah, it was reported quite a lot that Frank had opportunities to join numerous other clubs, and other clubs equally shortlisted him to the latter stages of their processes. And for various reasons, in some cases, Frank said no to some opportunities. He was quite patient and confident in his own ability to wait for what he felt was right for him. And in other cases, look, there's no shame in going up in a 2-horse race for a job with Arne Slot and being decided, we're going to go with with the other guy. But as someone who's, again, able to look at it with an unbiased lens and someone who kind of wants to see Frank succeed, when he got the Spurs job before you were covering Spurs, well, actually, you were already covering Spurs, but even if you weren't covering Spurs, would you be going, oh no, Thomas, what have you done? You've set yourself up there. Or are you thinking, great, he's going to show everyone here what he's made of? What do you make of it from that kind of reflection?
There were other clubs I was a little bit more concerned about if he would have joined. And that was Chelsea and Man United, just because Manchester United they're a little bit directionless at the moment. And so when he was being linked with them around the FA Cup final last year, I did think maybe with the new leadership structure in place, that might work, but something just tells me not all is good there. And then with Chelsea, it just felt like all of these new players were being foisted on each different manager, and there wasn't really too much control. And I felt like he's come from somewhere in Brentford, which is extremely stable. He's got great relationships with Phil Giles, the director of football, the owner Matthew Benham, the technical director Lee Dykes. And so I thought just going into a structure where there seems to be a lot more upheaval in senior executive roles, I just didn't think would really work for him. And so when he was linked with Spurs, to be honest, even going back a couple of years, I felt like Spurs would be a good fit for him. He wouldn't have to leave London, firstly. But secondly, just I think what the club had done in the past and what they're now doing again, bringing in younger players, trying to grow organically over a period of time, I think that suits him perfectly. And that's what obviously Spurs did under Pochettino, and they moved away from that for a couple of years, but they've gone back to that, and that's encouraging to see. And then obviously his pre-existing relationship with Johan Lange, they're both from Denmark. They worked at a Danish club called Lyngby together, I think in 2006, so nearly 2 decades ago. I just knew that would give him an ally in the building straight from the off. It means he probably can hit the ground running. So I just looked at it and thought, there's a lot of talent in this team. They're very young. They need someone who's good at development, and he ticks all those boxes. So when I saw the interest ramping up, I thought this would be a good fit for him if it gets over the line. But I've also been in this situation so many times where I thought, until I see the club announcement, I'm not going to fully believe it's actually happened.
And I know there's many out there that still won't believe it's happened until he's actually spoken. But I know there's
true.
He's on holiday at the moment. So look, I think given what comes with the Tottenham job, and as we know as fans, take your bloody time on that holiday, because this is going to be one of the jobs where you're going to need a good holiday before you start. I tell you, Thomas, we're wishing you all the best luck. We are. One of the things I do want to ask you, Jay, before we move on to the fact about how much he absolutely hates losing, which I know is an article that you've published only recently in The Athletic about getting to know Frank, and which again is fabulous. And I implore Jim to actually, starting this show, make sure you do go and check out a lot of the coverage that The Athletic are going to be providing this season. And obviously for Jay, that has obviously worked alongside Frank in terms of pressers at Brentford, there will be no better man, in our opinion, I'm sure we'll agree, that's going to cover him in such detail and understand in the way Jay will, having had that experience with him at Brentford. You said you had no concerns about him coming to Tottenham. I mean, some fans will think, how many matches that we've been through over the last how many years, there's always a concern when someone else comes to the football club. Luckily, you're still quite new into this, Jay. For me and Jim, how many years we've been here, it's a little bit different. But we discussed the fact there's been a lot of upheaval around the club. This Scott Munn that obviously looks like he's departing. You've had Vinay Venkatesham that's come in. Obviously, Donna Cullen has stepped down recently. Fabio Paratici is kind of lurking in the background. Daniel Levy is a figure or chairman of the football club, as you know, has come under a huge amount of criticism. More than actually I think I've ever seen, certainly in the last 12, 18 months as chairman of the club. We've had protests, as you're aware, last season as well. He's given, I wouldn't say giving away, but obviously he's leaving a very stable, comfortable environment at Brentford to come to a club that, as you know, being on the Spurs beat and interacting with analysts like, obviously, journalists like Ali Gold, for example, and people around that kind of circuit, there's many that don't really quite understand what the objective is at a club like Tottenham, or what can keep you in that job longer than 2 seasons plus, because we have been hitting the reset button. And look, 22 defeats in the Premier League is unacceptable. 25 overall, we obviously understand. I think many do understand why a change had to be made. Do you feel that he's ready to be under that microscopic lens of Enoch, of Daniel Levy, and cope with that amount of pressure on him personally, with how everybody has in some way or another really failed to get time in the Tottenham job for quite a considerable amount of time, probably going back to Pochettino?
That's sort of the $1 million question. As I alluded to a minute ago, Thomas Frank's got fantastic relationships with everybody at Brentford, from the director of football to the owner to the CEO to the chairman. He lost 8 of his first 10 games, and there was never any hint that he was going to get sacked. And I've obviously dealt a lot with people at Brentford and know how the people who run that club work. And often what I hear is that they're quite emotionless, and they obviously all come from a statistical background. And so what they're very good at is looking at a bad performance, for example, and saying, what is the underlying data telling us? Is this a bad result and it was unlucky and it was a last minute goal and it was a fluky deflection or something? Or is this intrinsically a bad performance and we need to monitor this? And so I think Thomas Frank's been quite fortunate to work in a club which is secure, stable, confident in their own plan. Brentford have been criticised for a lot of the things they've done over the last 10 years. And it's only now that we're seeing the benefits of that playoff. They got hammered when they closed down their academy and opened their B team, but it was the right decision for them at the time. So what I'm trying to say is, people at Brentford don't panic. If things go wrong, they're willing to take time to see if it will correct itself. And actually, Mikkel Damsgaard is a perfect example of that. Damsgaard's first 2 years at Brentford were disrupted by injury. He didn't look physical enough for the Premier League. And to be honest, this time last year, I thought he's not going to make it. Now he's got 10 assists, which I think is the joint 4th highest in the division. So that sort of gives you the Brentford ethos. Now, to bring it back round to Spurs, as you said, for me, I think I was exposed to the 2-year rebuild happening every summer this season. I think I've now witnessed it with my own eyes. Like, oh, wow, actually, no manager really seems to last more than 18, 19 months. Postecoglou just about got to 2 years. I think he was sacked on his 2nd anniversary.
Yep.
So I really don't know how Thomas Frank navigates that, because so many other managers have tripped on that hurdle. What does success look for him like? Is it just getting back into the Champions League every season? Is it trying to win a cup competition? As we said, there's so much upheaval at the top of the club, and he's been used to so much stability. You know, Matthew Benham's owned Brentford since January 2012, but he was investing in them before then. The director of football's been there for 10 years. I know Daniel Levy's been around for a long time, but Vinay Venkatesham's just joined. Obviously, Scott Munn's left. We don't know what's going to happen with Paratici. It's quite an unstable working environment to go into. All you can sort of hope for is to say that pieces are being put in place, and now this is going to be the structure for the next 4, 5, 6 years. I'm sure not many people have faith that's going to be the case. But I do think it's going to be a real challenge for him to manage up just as much as it is to manage down with his players.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's going to be a massive challenge for sure. And I think, you kind of already touched upon it there with regards to kind of his long-term ambitions and the fact that when it comes to the job situation, how he's very carefully waited patiently for the right opportunity. And I think, it does feel there's a burning desire in him to prove that he's able to manage at the top level. And I think one of the things that's really come across when I've watched a lot of interviews, whether it be podcasts, that he detests losing, he hates losing. And I think it's interesting. I think there was a game where he went to Anfield. I think they got beaten, but he said that even when he goes to these games, whether it be the Etihad, Stamford Bridge, the Emirates, he goes there in hope of winning or expecting to win, because he actually drills that into his players. How important is that, Jay? Because, from a mentality perspective at Tottenham, yes, we got over the line in terms of obviously, of course, Europa League, and we've won that trophy, and it's fantastic. And we hope now the fact that these players are winners, that's going to massively prop them up and really give these players genuine belief when it comes to going to tougher venues. But having a manager that also has that genuine belief of going away to the top 4, top 6 clubs in the Premier League with genuine belief, I can win here. How much do you see that rubbing off on this group of players for you?
Makes a massive difference. I never forget when Brentford beat Man City at the Etihad just before the World Cup in 2022. Haaland was an injury doubt. And in his press conference, Thomas Frank said, like, I really hope Haaland plays. I hope De Bruyne starts. Like, I want to try and beat Man City. I want to beat them at full strength. And this was 2 days after they lost to Gillingham in the Cup. And I know Cup competitions, I think, is something we might touch on in a minute. And I was just sat there thinking, they need to just get this game over and done with. Just roll over, accept you're going to lose. You've just been knocked out of the Carabao Cup by Gillingham. You're not going to beat City at the Etihad. And they played superbly that game. Tony should have scored a hat-trick. In the end, they win 2-1. But there was a point in that game in the second half where it was 1-1, and many, many managers in that situation, whether you were a manager of Burnley or Man United or Arsenal, whoever it was, would have said, I'm going for safety. I'm going to take off a striker. I'm going to bring on a defensive midfielder or another centre-back. We're going to soak up the pressure and try to stick it out. But Thomas Frank thought, you know what? I'm trusting these players and I believe in myself. I think we can win here. So he takes off Frank Onyeka, who's more of a defensive-minded central midfielder, brings on Josh Da Silva, takes off MBEUMO, brings on WISSA. So I'd say 2 attacking changes, one like for like, one offensive change. WISSA, Da Silva combine and set up Ivan Toney for the winner. And that just shows you the way his brain thinks. He always wants to try and push. They've obviously beaten, I think, every single member of the Big Six since they got promoted. I think they beat Chelsea at Stamford Bridge 3 seasons in a row. Beat Chelsea 4-1 at Stamford Bridge one season when Eriksen was there. Their performances in these games are exceptional. They always know how to tactically approach these teams. They surprise them. And obviously, I think it was Jurgen Klopp once said Brentford are basically sort of good at bending the rules. And I think he was trying to suggest that Brentford are nuisances from corners and set pieces, but Brentford aren't supposed to be nice for Liverpool to play against. They're supposed to make it hard. He was doing his job. What did Klopp want Brentford to do? Say, oh yeah, go on. We'll let you pass it around. We'll let Virgil van Dijk bully us from corners. So I think Frank's always been very good at using whatever's at his disposal and sort of maximising it.
Yeah, I found it funny, but just a slight sidetrack there when commentators and fans say that, because the ulterior motive is so clear, right? It's like everyone should come and play expansive football against us. Otherwise, they're breaking the game. No, you just know that you've got 11 world-class players in your team and they don't, and they're having to outsmart you in other ways. Exactly. You know if they go toe-to-toe, you'll win. It's one of those ones. But talking of like man management, though, Jay, he's had challenges beyond the injuries, and Brentford did have a lot of injuries, but they had Tony's suspension. But also what was interesting was the way that despite quite a few options, Christian Eriksen did choose to join Brentford. Do you feel like, does that represent something that Frank has in the way he manages personalities and characters? Because both those are tricky but different situations, particularly Tony's, but it seems to be managed pretty well from the outside.
Yeah, so I'll start off with Eriksen. With Eriksen, Thomas Frank's got a really long history with him. I think Thomas Frank managed him when he was in Denmark's youth teams and Thomas Frank was the head coach. So Thomas Frank's actually told this story on the Athletic podcast where his son basically told him, Eriksen's left Inter Milan, why don't you ring him up? And that's exactly what he did. He just rang him up and they just had a normal conversation. And obviously he made Eriksen feel like Brentford was going to be a safe enough environment to try and make a comeback from football. And in the end, he did it. With Ivan Toney, I think the way Thomas Frank handled it was exceptional. It's a really tricky situation. And there was a period of time where Thomas Frank sort of became a bit of a spokesperson for the Premier League at large on the influence of gambling within the world of football, because he was just getting asked about Toney every single week when Toney was being investigated, but he hadn't been officially punished or banned yet. And he never sort of shied away from those questions. I think it did get to a point when Toney was actually suspended where he did sort of say in a press conference, come on now, the guy's not even playing and I'm still getting these questions. But he always spoke openly and honestly, he didn't shy away from that topic, and it's not a simple one. And I always remember that when Toney started training again with Brentford, because if you remember, he was not allowed to train with them for 4 months. He had 2 meetings with Thomas Frank that week. And it was just as much about, we've got 4 months to get you in the best physical condition possible. It was also, how are you? Can I check in with you? during Tony's ban, Thomas Frank with a few of the other Brentford players and Tony all went to the Silverstone Grand Prix. I know that Thomas Frank, so Brentford's psychologist, a man named Michael Caulfield, who used to work in horse racing. He has a dog, a greyhound called Paisley, and he'll often take his dog into the Brentford training ground and walk around the training ground. And Thomas Frank often would go for walks with him, and they just talk about tactics, football, life, particular players. So he's always been really good at just opening himself up to different people. And I think he did that perfectly with Ivan Toney. There was also Luke Daniels, who played for Brentford in the Championship. Luke Daniels, I interviewed him once. He told me the story that I think some of his cars had been smashed into and stolen. And he told Thomas Frank, and Thomas Frank basically said, don't worry about coming into training. Make sure your family's okay. What on earth are you even thinking of coming into training for? It's much bigger things to deal with. So I think his human touch is definitely one of his biggest qualities. And
looking at those human touches from him as a leader to people who, you know, if there's reporting lines in football aren't kind of like what they are in the standard corporate world, but there is that structure where he's kind of the boss. But what about his boss, Johan Lange? You touched on him earlier. And you mentioned that they've, you know, got this outstanding relationship that they've had in the past. Do you feel that's going to be advantageous for him going into Spurs and a benefit in other ways as well, that could perhaps see him given, you know, the patience and time he deserves really to prove he can succeed in this role?
Yeah, definitely. Well, for people that don't know, Johan Lange also used to work at Aston Villa in a very similar role. And Thomas Frank was definitely interviewed, I think, when they sacked Dean Smith and hired Steven Gerrard. And I think they considered him when they sacked Steven Gerrard and hired Unai Emery. So Lange's sort of been keen on this reunion for some time. And I think what he immediately has in Lange is, firstly, and this might sound really simple, someone who's from the exact same background as him in Denmark and speaks the same language as him. So basically a friend, a confidant, someone who they've known each other for a really long period of time and probably understand how each other works. They might know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. I actually think there's quite a few similarities between Johan Lange and Brentford's director of football, Phil Giles. I think they're both quite understated people. You don't really hear from them too much. When you do hear from them, I don't really think they seek attention or glory, especially considering they're both heavily involved in transfers. And you certainly see executives at other clubs who want to take the glory for signing player X, Y, Z, or whoever it is. Yeah. I've always got the impression that Lange's quite mellow, quite focused, and not emotionless, but maybe in good control of his emotions. And as we've already alluded to, Thomas Frank can be quite emotional, especially after the defeat. So having someone to sort of offset that is probably going to be really beneficial for him. But yeah, I just think going into Spurs, as we've already alluded to, not many managers, well, no managers really have lasted particularly long in the last few years. So if you've already got an ally inside the building who's pushing for you and advocating for you, then it's definitely going to help.
I agree. Look, Jay, you've covered a lot of points that you were going to ask you in terms, which is great. You've covered off so much in terms of player development and progression, because I think one of the key things is, as you mentioned there, is that he's lost the likes of Watkins, Benrahma, Eriksson, Tony Ray. And I think one of the most impressive things about that is that despite losing such key fundamental players for who he's had to work with, the team has somehow ended up improving and getting better, which sounds crazy when you think about the time when those players have been in the respective sides. They've been key figureheads in the way he's built his Brentford team, which again speaks volumes of the coach he is, the development he does show. And I think as Tottenham fans gives us a lot of confidence about the young players that he's going to be managing and is going to be handling day to day. I know, again, one of the things you reported was around the fact of, I don't think they made contact with Brentford until June the 9th. So it kind of just shows you that it feels like Tottenham maybe did a lot of work in the background when it came to ensuring Thomas Frank was the right man for the club. And what it does feel, again, we talk about due diligence, we talk about, you know, the fact that the people around him. One of the key things that I know you've been very heavy talking about on The Athletic is around the coaching staff element and the people that he's bringing with him as the coach. I think this is a really important point that I want to turn to and ask you, because it did feel that we had that period of Frank is close to joining Tottenham, Frank is going to be appointed, and we had that kind of had a delay over 2-3 days where we're thinking, well, come on in. What's going on? It's close. It's going to happen. So why have we got this delay? And you've got to really know Spurs fans, Jay, right? I mean, Tottenham fans panic. There is no sense of calm. We only know one state of mode generally. I mean, I'm speaking here, but I know Danny, bless him, has also felt the same. There's a general panic around Tottenham. What's going on? What's happening? But it does feel the coaching staff element was such a really important point to getting this deal done? Because you may not be privy to this, but obviously we've had the likes of Nuno that have been here, Jose in the past, Antonio in the past, and it just felt that always one of the key sticking points around these managers was, are they actually going to get the coaching staff that they've worked with on a really important vocal daily basis that have helped them shape their respective careers? And it feels with Frank, the people that he surrounded himself with have been absolutely key to the success and the trajectory of wherever he's worked, and obviously Brentford being the key one. So I'm going to ask you a little bit, if you don't mind, about those coaching staff members. I think Justin Cochrane's one that does stick out because he's the former Spurs boy. I know a lot of people at Tottenham are delighted to see him back at the club because he spent over a decade away. I mean, just on that alone, do you want to tell us how important he will be to Frank? It does feel like he's his eyes, his ears. And I think for those that watch the, again, Sky Sports documentary A Day with Frank, you could see how pivotal it was that he leaves a lot of the stuff down to the coaching staffs. And I do think Justin in particular is such a trusted lieutenant of his, right? Yeah,
definitely. I should also say quickly, I have given Thomas Frank a lot of credit in this on this podcast, but a lot of it is also what happens behind the scenes at Brentford. So with the development of players, Brentford plan for transfer windows like 18 months in advance. So they would have already decided this player might leave in this window, so therefore we've got to have his replacement lined up. So Thomas Frank's been helped definitely by the fact that there's always been a succession plan. You know, even for example, at the beginning of this window, Brentford didn't sell Mark Flecken until they basically 100% guaranteed Kevin Kelleher. So the way they operate definitely helped Thomas Frank. On to Justin Cochrane. I implore everybody to go and watch interviews Brian MBEUMO and Johan WISSA have done this season, because they both talk about Justin Cochrane's influence. He's only been at the club, he's only been with Brentford for 3 years, but their attacking output has really gone to another level under Justin's time. So the way the split worked at Brentford was Klaus Norgard and Kevin O'Connor looked after the defence. Thomas Frank and Justin Cochrane generally looked after the attack. And you can watch videos online of Justin Cochrane. Remember, I think it was Keane Lewis Potter scores a goal in a training session, and 10 seconds before Keane Lewis Potter scores, Justin Cochrane saying, "Run to the back post, you'll score." So clearly he's got a sixth sense. But he's really, really switched on. He's got a fantastic background, as you alluded to. Spent nearly a decade in the Spurs Academy working with, I think, Scott Parker, John McDermott, Matt Wells. So that's going to be a really, I'm sure, a really nice reunion for the two of them to come back together. Then he worked with the England youth teams. And across his time at Spurs in England, I think he's worked with Madueke, Oliver Skipp, Yaphet Tanganga, possibly Kyle Walker-Peters. He was only at Man United for a year, but that was the year they won the FA Youth Cup final for the first time in a few years. And I think Garnacho and Kobbie Mainoo were part of that cohort. So you can see a little bit of his influence there. But look at a player like Kevin Schade at Brentford. Schade has all of the physical attributes to be an insanely good player. He's rapid. He's got an incredible jump. But I think he can be quite clunky. I don't think he's technically amazing yet. But he scored, I think, 12 goals in the Premier League this season. And Justin Cochrane's coaching has played a massive part in that. So I think for Thomas Frank, it was huge that Justin Cochrane came with him. I spoke to a few people at Brentford who were gutted he was going. And I think that's why the negotiations did drag on. They were reluctant to lose him. He definitely would have been a potential candidate to replace Thomas Frank if he'd stayed at Brentford. But selfishly, from Thomas Frank and Spurs' perspective, they'll be thinking, this is an absolute result. We've taken him with us. It was imperative that they took him with him.
I can ask you, Jay, very quickly, just before we do go for the next break, and I want to bring Jim to come in on this as well, if he's interested too. The likes of Chris Haslam, very much trusted ally of Thomas Frank, and Joe Newton, the analyst. And the reason why I laugh about Joe is, bless him, he looks so young in the Sky Sports documentary, but he seemed to know exactly what Frank was needing or requiring when it came to showing certain footage around clips of play. And you could just see that as a young boy there to some degree, quite a shy lad, but Frank had total confidence in the job that he was doing for him when it comes to giving him what he required to then be able to translate back to the players. And I mean, you'll know this from, I think, even last season, Jay. I mean, there's been a lot of people on this show crying out for a set piece coach. We need a set piece coach. We have to get a set piece coach. It does appear Tottenham have got a set piece coach, I believe, in Andreas Jorgensen. So just a couple of those other coaching staff members, how integral will they be for Frank in terms of a group and how they're going to work?
Yeah, so Chris Haslam is or was Brentford's head of athletic performance, and he'd been there for over a decade across 2 spells. But he had been there the entire time Thomas Frank was at Brentford as an assistant and then as head coach. So they've been together for, I think, 9 years in total. So that sort of gives you an inkling and an understanding of why Thomas Frank has brought him with him. That I think they're extremely close friends. Thomas Frank will often take his closest friends and coaches out for dinner a few times a year, and Chris Haslam's one of them, and they sometimes link up with Dean Smith again, which is always quite nice to see. But what you'll notice with Chris Haslam is he's sort of I think Matt Wells sort of took on this role last season, where Matt Wells would be the one telling the substitutes, right, I want Richarlison to come off the bench now, and then he'd give them the instructions, and then Matt Wells would liaise with the 4th official. So Chris Haslam often did a lot of that for Brentford last season. On to Joe Newton. Joe's been with Brentford, I think, since 2019. He actually was a player. I think he was at Tranmere Rovers when he was younger, played a little bit in non-league. And so he's been at Brentford for a really long time, and he's been another core piece of the puzzle where they've gone from the Championship mid-table into an established Premier League side. And then Andreas Gordson obviously spent a little bit of time at Manchester United. He's been at MBEUMO, but I think he sort of got his first big break in English football as Brentford set-piece coach. And I know set-piece coaches are very fashionable these days, but Brentford were definitely the pioneers of this. And Andreas was one of the first back when they were in the Championship. I think it would have been the 2019-20 season. So I'm sure Thomas Frank is really glad that Gordson has been sort of reunited with them all as well.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how it does play out. Jay, I got to ask you, it's been a fascinating interview so far. Can we still have a 15 minutes of your time? Is that okay with you?
On one condition, I can quickly go to the toilet.
Of course. Listen, let's let Jay go to the toilet. We'll let Jay go to the toilet. This is how professional we are on Last Word on Spurs. We're going to let Jay take a trip to the loo. As that is happening, let's have a look at Thomas Frank in action on the training ground. And they'll never know Jay was away. Let's see Thomas Frank in action.
Yes! Good. I like it, Frank. Brilliant. Yes. React. It's fine. A little bit higher, me. A little bit higher. So on the outside. You need a bounce. Yes. Okay. Time. Brilliant, Miles, Brian. Now we're there. Okay, let's go. Out, Vita. Yes. Just straight up. Better! Now we play a little bit more on the outside. And here where you went down there, where Chris, he just needs to go higher, okay? So we fill into really good. So get those positions. So make sure, for example, the outside in the back 3, whoever that is, make sure we are high enough so we can take the ball forward. Then we'll have a back 4 who's defending. So if we make the breakthrough, we can attack 6 versus 5. If we lose it, we defend 4 versus 5. Love it, Wes! Play! Frankie. Perfect position for the bounce, okay? Really, really good.
I think that's a big expectation. I know they haven't had the best season, but if you look at their lineup, just take their front 3, I think a lot of clubs would have taken them any day. I know more players there could be Kulusevski, but let's say their midfield, Kulusevski, Bentancur, MBEUMO. That's a very, 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 very good Premier League midfield. And then I know they haven't had a centre-back, but maybe Gray and Bennett and Davies played the best defensive game of the season. So Porro is fantastic as right-back. He's got Trent-ish offensive qualities, and Spence have done very well, Kingsley. So we can't expect... If we expect that, then there's something wrong with our fans. Or something wrong with... In the Premier League, it's difficult every game. Wow. Honestly, wow. It's a good team. They are a good team with good players. And you totally fair, honestly, completely well-deserved win. Well done. Couple of things. 100 Premier League games for Naga. 200 games for Brentford, Ethan Pinnock. Oh. As you know, it's a full squad. We need everyone available, everyone being ready. Fabio, Igor doing very well, just coming in. Damson and Kevin had to be some finisher, helpful finisher, making the 4-2 goals. So it's done. Very good. Thank you again, Ben. I know you want to play, and I know it's all that top professional. And the way I see all the bits you speak to all the centre backs and all that means the world. Just to let you know, it's not easy. So thank you very much for that. Yeehaw, Yamalu. What a player, guys.
Hello and welcome back to the final part of this last word on Spurs. Before we bring Jay back in there, Jim, do you get a feeling that the dressing room are going to really like Thomas Frank? I mean, I'm not just saying that, but you can see he's got a real bond there, can't you, Jim, with the players and the way they interact with him. He's just got such a lovely way about him, like the nature of the character himself.
Yeah, I mean, whatever your opinion was on Ange as a fan to a manager, it's clear that the dressing room had a real deep-lying connection with him. And whoever the next manager was going to be, that was going to be one of the 2 or 3 major kind of things they need to overcome. But I think based on what we're hearing from Jay and from, watching with the media and everything we're uncovering now, I think those reservations are quickly disappearing, because it feels like he has that personality that brings groups together, and he will bring them on a journey with him. And he won't be scared if there's 1 or 2 people in there who say, I'm going to push back on you. I don't think he's going to be shy from finding a calm way of moving them out the picture and bringing in people who want to be part of that journey. So I think you had to get the right personality as part of this recruitment, and I think we've done that with Frank.
Totally.
But Jay, I had a couple of questions here. One, and I'll combine them together because they may overlap a little bit into your answers. But Frank had a slow start at Brentford and at his first club as well when he was in a head coach role. And you'll probably get asked this constantly. But do you see that slow start kind of coming into Spurs, and any reasons why you think it might be a thing that follows him? And the second bit is around managing Europe as well, because Frank being a data-heavy manager, you don't often get that opportunity to sit the players down, rehearse things, go over the data when you've got 3 games in a week. So it's kind of a 2-part question there. Do you think the slow start will happen to Spurs and what maybe causes it? And second is around how he maybe perhaps will manage those additional fixtures without the time to kind of prepare for games.
So on the slow starts, I'm trying to sort of wrap my brain to back when he first started at Brentford. I remember asking him about this before, and I know it's easy to say in hindsight, but I think they were unlucky in quite a few games. And there was also something quite difficult happened at Brentford during that time as well, where their technical director, Rob Rowan, passed away. And I think that had quite a profound impact on people at the club. And so I think his first couple of months was just about everybody at the club uniting and sort of just powering through and sort of trying to move on from what had been quite a traumatic experience for everybody. I hope I've got that timeline right. And in terms of if history will repeat itself at Spurs, I think he's massively helped out by the fact there's no international tournament this summer. I don't think any Spurs players will be in the Gold Cup, right? So the fact that he can get everybody in early for pre-season, whereas last season Romero was still, I think, playing for Argentina in the Copa America final when Spurs were playing their first pre-season friendly, I think will be huge. I don't necessarily like the fact his first competitive game is against PSG in the UEFA Super Cup, but hey, he could win a trophy in his first game, so you should look at it the other way. I think sometimes it might just take a little bit of time for him to get his specific ideas across. And that can happen with managers sometimes. But the most important thing is when he is given that time, quickly they get results. Now, with the Champions League, this is sort of, I think, going to be the biggest challenge for him, because I think the only other experience of European competition he's got is getting Brøndby to the Europa League qualifying round. So it's a very, very different world he's about to step into.
Yep.
And obviously it's the expanded version of the Champions League as well. So it's now 8 games. You've got an extra 2 to contend with. So I do worry about that a little bit. I think I've said on other podcasts, he's got this 24-hour rule where he likes a little bit of time to process his emotions, etc. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, I don't think you can have a 24-hour rule if you're playing on a Sunday and you've got to fly to a different country on a Monday and you've got a Champions League game on a Wednesday. But what I will say is it's a good challenge for him to have as a head coach. This is a challenge he's wanted for his entire life. You know, I put it in one of my pieces that he'd often watch Champions League games in midweeks with his coaching staff, with people like Justin Cochrane and Chris Haslam, and they'd debrief on those games. I definitely remember being in press conferences saying, "Oh, did you watch the Champions League game last night?" And he's like, "Of course I did. I just stayed up with my colleagues in a room at my house watching it with them." So I think he'll be absolutely relishing the opportunity to test himself in the Champions League, and I think that's what Spurs fans should take a little bit of optimism from. Also, one of the difficulties last season, Postecoglou admitted they approached the start of the season wrong, and then what that then happened was the beginning of the season was all right, but by the time November, December rolled around, a lot of those players had played too many games already, and then it became too difficult to manage those two competitions. I think definitely a few more bodies will be needed in the squad this summer. It was lightweight last season. They can't allow that to happen again. So it's not just on Thomas Frank to learn from his previous mistakes and manage competitions better. It's also to make sure that Johan Lange, Daniel Levy, etc., support him in the transfer market and make sure that the squad is big enough to contend in the Premier League and the Champions League.
Yeah, I agree. Look, we are entering into quick mode territory with regards to questions. I want to say again, we're joined by the wonderful Jay Harris from The Athletic, where over 6,500 of you are watching the show live. Thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs. You can hear Jay's dulcet tones on the View from the Lane podcast. Is it once, twice a week at the moment, Jay? How many times is Danny getting you together at the moment? Is he letting you have a little bit of time off?
A little bit. This summer it will be once a week, and then obviously when the season rolls around, or probably a couple of weeks before the start of the season, we'll be back to 2 a week.
Brilliant. That's how you can check all Jay's stuff, obviously on his X handle. Jay, anything else worth promoting you've got out there where people can check out all your latest articles, coverage on Tottenham?
Not really. I mean, I do occasionally put silly things on Instagram, as obviously you've exposed me for some of my interactions. So I sometimes share that stuff more on Instagram than Twitter, but it's the exact same handle as my Twitter, JDM Harris. Lovely.
Just on that point, final piece of exposure, right? The last thing that we're going to play out, we're going to play this final piece of video that we've just had from Jay and Thomas interacting, and then we're going to go through some very, very quick fire questions. Let's check this out.
11:30 at night. Had to go via McDonald's, but there was no milkshake or ice cream. So
No milkshake?
no milkshake.
Apparently they have the best milkshake.
Not the best, but up there.
What a day. What a day.
I'll tell you what, it's going to be fascinating to see you, Jay, cover Thomas Frank at Tottenham. I just get a vibe it's going to be a bit of a different kind of conversation. Do you agree it's going to be a bit of a different, or maybe not? What do you reckon?
There'll still be room for jokes and stuff like that. It will probably be a little bit more serious depending on the game, but I still think that is his personality, right? He's made jokes with other people. It's not just me. So I don't think he'll change that, and I don't think we want him to change that.
No, absolutely not. Listen, if we're winning every week, you can ask him whatever you want, Jay, however you want to ask him. Right, let's go for some very, very quick fire questions. I want to ask you about cup competitions. In the last, I think, 4 seasons in the FA Cup, Thomas Frank has never gone beyond the 4th round. And in the last 3 seasons, he's lost in the 3rd round at home every year. Now, I know Jason McGovern, bless him, who's on this show regularly, says if that's at Tottenham, that's a big, big problem. You've just come off seeing a parade, of course, outside of the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and what it meant to fans to win the Europa League. How important is it, in your opinion, and we'll try and go through these quick fire, he gets the balance of the cups right in his upcoming season at Tottenham?
Yeah, so I'm glad this got brought up because I should have mentioned it before. And I think he's definitely been guilty of rotating too much in those cup competitions, making 7 or 8 changes to the starting 11, sort of hoping that the Brentford B team will get the job done, and they end up having a far more difficult game than he anticipated. I know I mentioned the Gillingham game earlier because they beat Man City afterwards, but the Gillingham game was farcical. You know, Gillingham got stuck in traffic. So where Brentford Stadium is located, just off an A road, Gillingham's players had to get off the coach and basically run to the stadium so they could basically have a 10-minute warm-up, went out and played and beat them on penalties. So you're thinking, hang on a second, these guys have jumped straight off the bus and beaten you lot. Obviously, the Plymouth game that happened earlier this year, that wasn't good enough. Yeah, he's definitely been guilty of rotating too much. But also at the same time, it's a very different circumstance at Brentford. For the last 4 years, all they've cared about is stay in the Premier League. So they've had to put all their eggs in that basket. The season in the Championship, when I can't remember if it was 2019-20 or 2020-21, but when Spurs got to the Carabao Cup final, they beat Brentford. I think was it 1-0 or 2-0? I think it was 2-0, wasn't it? In the semi-final, when it was only one leg, and I think De Silva got sent off for a foul when it was only 1-0. So it was a tight game. So he also, I think, got Brentford to the quarterfinal of the Carabao Cup in his first year, or the fifth round. Is fifth round quarterfinal? I don't even know these days. And I remember they lost to Chelsea. I think Chelsea got a late penalty. So I think when the circumstances are right, he takes those competitions seriously. But I think he would probably also admit he has maybe taken his eye off the ball them a little bit. I certainly don't want him. I don't want to see him make that mistake again at Spurs.
It'll be interesting to watch that one, because I find, like with any manager, you're not probably going to get sacked if you come fourth every single season, but you are going to get sacked if you have poor league performances and win the occasional trophy. So it's so hard to get the balance when you're a Spurs. You're like, we demand the trophies that City get, but we're not capable of having the same size squad as a club like that. So it's a tough one. But just talking about attacking players and building the squad and making it stronger, there's obviously endless Brentford players naturally going to be linked, and MBEUMO being the most prevalent one in the media. Do you feel those are, realistically likely to happen, any of those moves, or is this just, 2 and 2 equals 4 kind of stuff at the moment when looking at transfer rumours?
I'm sorry to break your heart, but it's probably 2 + 2 equals 4. I think Brentford would probably make it quite difficult for Thomas Frank to go back in and take any of his previous players. I think the only reason there might be a possible opportunity with MBEUMO is because it's been an open secret for a long time. People have told me that within the club that they sort of accepted that MBEUMO would go this summer. He's got a year left on his deal, although there is a 12-month option. He's obviously I think he's just turned 25. He's about to turn 26 in August. So approaching the peak of his career, this is like the optimum opportunity for him to go. So that sort of makes sense. But if Thomas Frank went back in for any other players, I think they'd be making it hard for him. And I think they'd be putting the price right up high. Although I know Spurs were interested in Johan WISSA in January. And I think at that time, that signing would have made so much sense. Whether that gets revisited or not, I'm not too sure. But he's a multifunctional player who can play left wing, centre forward. I'm sure he could even play right wing if you asked him to. And a signing like that makes sense. But I don't know if they'd be able to pull it off or not.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know it's going to be quite a fascinating summer, and it has already been reported and obviously known now that Frank has already got his first player through the door at Tottenham. Whether he personally wanted him is another question, Jay. I mean, I'm intrigued to ask you, Matisse Tel, you watched him up close and personal, of course, last season. He does become that first signing of the Thomas Frank era. We understand the fee is in the region of around the 35 million euro mark. They've obviously knocked off quite a significant amount from what was originally the buy option that Tottenham had with regard to that agreement with Bayern. There's been reports out that Frank has personally studied the player himself. He felt it was a good move for the club and he would have given his approval. How believable do you think that is, Jay, in the world of football?
What I will say is that I don't consider Tel to be the first signing of the Frank era, because obviously Postecoglou was very vocal about how he'd convinced Tel to join, and that Tel was not. I think he said something like, "I didn't convince him to come here just for 6 months." So I always felt like this was going to get over the line. I don't know if Thomas Frank has any direct contact with Tel. I'd be quite surprised if he hadn't done. If Tel's basically got a decision as to whether he goes back to a club or not, he would surely want to have some sort of interaction with the new head coach, because if Thomas Frank didn't want him or had a completely different tactical plan, Tel would probably be like, well, I don't really fancy that. But Tel is probably, you can sort of put him in the same bracket as MBEUMO and Johan WISSA, really young forward, quite raw, guilty of taking too many shots at times, who needs to just be finessed, needs the crinkles in his game ironed out. And Thomas Frank's a very good head coach who's got a great track record of doing that type of thing. So I'm sure Tel's also looking at it as, well, hang on a second, this guy's made MBEUMO look good. He's made WISSA look good. He's made Tony look good. Yeah. I think I can work with this guy.
Love that.
Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum of where wingers are in their Spurs careers, he's got quite a big, important conversation to have with Sonny as well, doesn't he? How do you think he's going to handle that one?
To be honest, I think he's got two big decisions this summer, and I think that's on Sonny and Romero. They're both really tricky situations. And with Son, I don't really know what the ideal outcome is, because has he underperformed last season because the style of play didn't suit him perfectly. I think there is an argument for that. For me personally, if I think of the ideal Son Heung-Min goal or the archetypal Son Heung-Min goal, it's sort of him running onto a through ball from Kane in the middle of the pitch.
Yeah.
Whereas I think there were too many times last season where he was more over to the left wing. So would Frank potentially tweak the tactics around and Son gets in positions closer to the goal? Then in that case, I'd want him to stay a little bit longer. But at the same time, there were so many games last year where I just thought Son was so pedestrian in possession and he didn't look confident taking players on. And that's a little bit concerning. He's the club captain. So if he's not going to start week in, week out, do you give the captaincy on the pitch to someone else, but keep Sonny as club captain? I really think this is the first sort of big hurdle that Thomas Frank has to navigate. I'm not really too sure what he should do. He obviously needs to sit down with Sonny, speak to him, see what he's like in pre-season, understand if he can sort of get him in better positions closer to goal and go from there.
It'll be interesting how it does play out. And obviously the other situation you mentioned, Jay, which does feel this could be a more explosive potential situation over the summer, is that of Christian Romero. It's a kind of two-part question. I know we're really conscious of time, so I don't want to keep you too long as well because you've been fantastic for us. We've loved having you on here. Obviously, it took just 56 minutes after Frank's appointment to get the reaction from Romero, who congratulated Ange Postecoglou for achieving the Europa League and also the fact that he's departed the club, where he sent, of course, his love and his flowers to him. I mean, the biggest, obviously, thing to come out of this Romero quote was on the fact that from day one, you paved the way despite the many obstacles that always existed and always will exist. I'm just wondering, Jay, how you personally read that and decipher that, given it feels like he's taken another boot at the chairman and the hierarchy at the club in less than 6 months. He's kind of gone in 2 foot on them, which, don't get me wrong, I think, if you ask many Tottenham fans out there, they wouldn't really have a problem with what you said about, the ambition, because we all want the club to be ambitious. But I just wonder, at what point does Daniel Levy and the hierarchy draw the line and say, right, that's enough, we need to get you out of here? And do you think, in a way, the way he's kind of worded it and the way he's framed it and the timing of it is him angling now for an exit? Because, again, I said it at the start of the show, we're having Diego Simeone now come out publicly and say, I'd love Romero at Atletico Madrid.
I think the timing of it is naughty because however he feels about Postecoglou, he had a week or so to sort of make that opinion public. And so I guess the fan base have sort of mourned the loss of Ange. They've moved on to Thomas Frank. Everybody's trying to get excited. And then obviously Romero puts that statement out and it sort of just, it deflates the excitement of Thomas Frank being appointed a little bit. Part of me thinks that the sort of best case scenario for all parties this summer is that he leaves. As you've alluded to it, or not alluded to it, as you've mentioned, Simeone's been quite public about his admiration for Romero. Romero has publicly flirted and spoken about moving to La Liga. Something just sort of tells me that maybe it's just best if everybody says, thank you so much, Romero. You've helped us win a first piece of silver in 17 years. You're sort of giving us the indication that, not that you think you're better than us, but you need some sort of new challenge. So maybe you go off and do that new challenge. We're going to give that money to Thomas Frank to sign a centre-back who he wants, and we'll all move on, because what you don't want to happen is the final sort of week of the transfer window, Romero's maybe still there. The links are still sort of lurking on in the background, and it just means that the start of the season is a little bit unsettled. You want this sort of, in an ideal world, sort of dealt with before the pre-season tour, but Atletico are in the Club World Cup at the moment. Am I right in thinking? So that probably impacts the fact that they're not going to sign him anytime soon. But yeah, these two situations, Frank has to handle them very delicately.
You back him to do it, Jay? Back him to get it right?
I think so, yeah. I think especially with Son, you sort of have to let Son make his own decision. He's given such an incredible service to the club over the years. I think you sort of have to say, if you feel like it's time for a new chapter, then it's a shame, but go ahead. If you want to stick around and sort of continue to be a leader and play a really pivotal role in this next, I don't want to say project, but this next project, then I'll have you. But I think you sort of have to give him the decision. And then with Romero, the best thing might be for everybody to sit down and say, what are your concerns? How do you feel? Do you want to stick around? If you don't, let's sort of speed that up as quickly as possible.
All comes down to results as well, doesn't it, Jay? It's like, I think he's in a situation with those decisions where, for once, most people would be open-minded to the idea of those players leaving, where if you ask them last season, they go, absolutely not. But if he starts well, everyone will go, genius moves to rebuild the squad and let those guys move on. But if you go through, a few wobbly performances, then the noise starts of, oh my gosh, how could you let your vice captain and captain go? You made your own bed, even though his hands were quite tied. But that is how us fans behave. So it is what it is. But the final question, Jay, is we like to ask what you think Frank's target will be in his own mind. And also, we've got to get receipts. What's your prediction of where he'll finish in his first season in the league? Should we just say the league and the Champions League?
Be kind.
There's too many comps otherwise.
We want to try and get Jay back on in January, and we go all, if we go all out, we might not get him back in January. So let's be kind. Let's be kind.
I tell you, I guarantee you, this is what Thomas Frank is going to say in his first press conference. I want to finish as high as possible. The amount of times I've heard him say that at Brentford, it's ingrained in my brain. No matter how many times you pressure him, he'll just say, win the next game, finish as high as possible. If he was being honest, I'm sure he'd want to finish in the top 6. The top 4 is extremely competitive these days. So I think he would be saying to himself, I really want to crack into the top 6, and I want to make this team defensively solid again.
Yep.
Champions League, last 16 minimum, I think. It's quite difficult to go out of the league phase, right? The top 24 teams go through. So I know Ricky, you're giving me a look of like, well, if anybody can do it, Spurs can do it. But if the top 24 teams go through, and even if Spurs are not in the top 8, you'd like to think they'd win the playoff against whichever team it is. Although actually some of the playoff games last year were quite fierce, weren't they?
I know, right?
Was Man City, Real Madrid a playoff game?
Yeah.
Maybe I take it back. I'd like to see, last 16 of the Champions League and top 6 in the Premier League. I think both are achievable. I think that's what you should be aiming for. The reason why the league form was so shocking last year is because there's so much quality in this team. You look at Man United, and I sort of think, well, Man United are a bad team with bad players. Whereas I look at Spurs and think, you're a quality team. Van der Ven, Solanke, Romero on his day, Udogie, Rocario. But you're just playing poorly, and there's obviously different reasons for that. So Spurs, I think, top 6, Champions League last 16. Please don't hate me when that doesn't happen.
Listen, Jay, you have been worth the wait. Before we find out where we can find Jay across all the socials, Jim, I'm sure you agree. What a fabulous interview, right? I mean, I think for many out there that don't know a huge amount about Thomas Frank, a lot of people have learned a lot in this last hour and a half about what we are getting into with Frank. And I can just see it's a lot of Frank fever right now, Jim. A lot of people are excited. Is it fair to say that? It's a build-up of real excitement. Yeah,
and I think everyone should be. It's like without that trophy monkey on the back for Spurs, I just feel we can breathe again. Even in the office today, I was letting it loose on the Gooners. I was looking at who was Prime Minister again when Arsenal last won. Just giving it all back. It just felt so good, and I feel like Frank can come into this knowing that we believe in him. He's got our backing. He's got most of us behind him patiently now. Bring us some happiness back in the league initially, and we're all kind of there for the journey on Thomas the Frank engine. So let's do it.
And Tottenham have done this really well because we haven't yet heard the Frank interview. We've been made to wait for days and days now, and it's like Jay says, because we haven't had it yet. When it does drop, you just know there's going to be certain. You're going to be like, oh, this is amazing. It's going to be great. Jay, you've been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, you've been worth the wait on this show. We've had to wait a while to get you. We've got you now. We're going to hopefully get you back in January and find out where we are down the line with Tottenham at that point. Where can we find the wonderful work you do for the Spurs community, where you will be up close and personal with Thomas Frank once again? And we're looking forward to seeing that.
Just follow me on JDM Harris on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram. Obviously, you can check out my work and people like Jack Pitt-Brooke on The Athletic. And then, of course, on View from the Lane with Danny Kelly and the rest of the gang.
Jay, you've been absolutely superb. Listen, we implore you, go and follow Jay across social media. Go and, like I say, listen and watch the lot of articles that are out there on Thomas Frank. And go and, like I say, subscribe to The Athletic. Great source when it comes to all things Tottenham. And Jay will have you covered every step of the way. I'm sure, which will be a fascinating roller coaster, as it always is in the world of Tottenham. Just a little bit calmer for us this season, and a bit more stable. With a trophy, please, from the wonderful Jim from Oh So Spurs, from the superb, brilliant Jay Harris, from me. We have been the last word on Spurs. Please keep safe, keep well, and as always, come on, you Spurs.